everybody. I hope you're enjoying the conference so far, and grateful for all of you getting up so early, especially the students who are here. 9 o'clock on a Friday is a real act of commitment for an undergraduate student. So we've got a great panel here this morning, old forgotten words and ancient melodies. The theme is generally here on faith and the arts. And now the theme of this conference is higher powers, which is the relationship between God, the human person, and the state. We're going to take the liberty of expanding that theme to talk about public life. And public life includes more than the state. And one of the most important parts of public life are the arts. And a public life bereft of that would be an empty one indeed. So we have three wonderful emerging scholars here to talk about the visual arts, to talk about literature, and to talk about music. I'll do a brief introduction of each person, and then we'll kind of work our way down the line. So immediately to my left is Carole Baker, who's a doctoral in theology candidate at Duke Divinity School. Her dissertation, Communion of Incorruption, a Theology of Icons and Relics, looks at the theological significance of relics and holy images and the ecclesiology that informs that significance. Baker also studies traditional icon writing with the Russian Orthodox school of iconology and exhibits contemporary paintings and installations in both sacred and secular spaces. She is the mother of two, and she will be talking about the icon as exemplary image, reflections on iconology, and the visual arts. Immediately to her left is Jay Martin, who is the co-director of the Science and Religion Initiative in the Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame. He's also a doctoral candidate in systematic theology at the University of Notre Dame, where he has also earned his Master's of Theological Studies. He writes and researches modern Catholic theology and its engagement with theory, particularly psychoanalysis, French and German philosophy, and radical emancipatory political theory. Jay's talk will be, Where Did You Sleep Last Night? The Foreclosure of Desire and the Failure of Law in the Americana Murder Ballad. Finally, we have James Wilson from Yale Divinity School. James is a graduate of Deep Springs College and the University of Virginia, and is currently working toward his MDiv at Yale. He's written for American Songwriter and Commonweal, as well as taught classes on Faulkner in Charlottesville and Nashville. He's currently working on a book on Faulkner and Christianity. James' band, Sons of Bill, has toured in 16 different countries and has 2 albums which have broken into the Billboard Top 200 chart in the US and the UK. And he'll be talking on Faulkner, religion, and the modern world. So we actually have, in addition to 3 scholars, we have 2 artists on the panel, which is really interesting. 3 if you include Jay Martin's beatboxing abilities. We'll start at the end and work our way over with James on Faulkner, religion, and the modern world. Each paper will be approximately 20 minutes, and we'll have time for questions at the end. Thank you, James.
All right. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you so much, Professor Pojanowski, for having me. It's an honor to be here with you all to briefly talk about some of my work with one of the most difficult and courageous writers of the 20th century, William Faulkner, and his complicated and often misunderstood relationship to the Christian faith. My interest and obsession with Faulkner began when I was 16 years old, and I asked my father for some literary advice, and he told me to read My Southerners in the summer and read Your Russians in the winter because defeated peoples tell better stories. And it was great advice. And so I picked up The Sound and the Fury at the age of 16, and it changed my life. And what I experienced then was such like an emotional depth charge as a teenager that I could only describe it as religious. And it was this painful recognition and sense of self-discovery, which I struggled to articulate at the time. And then just approaching it from a personal perspective, more than any theologian or Christian apologist or priest, Faulkner became my interlocutor in regards to life's deepest, most personal religious questions. In many ways, he was my Virgil, my pagan comrade who met me outside the gates of hell and midway through the journey of my life when I found myself in the dark wood. But it was also this reading it just experientially, though I didn't understand it at such a young age, was a sense of awakening to a deeper level of reality. As Robert Penn Warren writes, to read Faulkner is to be released into life, into the sense of a grand and disturbing meaningfulness beneath the crust of life, and into a moral reality beneath the crust of history. And yet, when I tried to find secondary literature on the topic, I found there wasn't anything that I found pouring through books that even began to articulate with Faulkner what I had experienced. There's been more books published about Faulkner in the last 50 years than any other American author. It's over 3,000 books, and most of them are horrendously bad. So I was trying to understand why this was happening, and Thomas Merton actually had an aha moment with Faulkner and his stake on religion in modern life, and was planning on writing a book, but then he tragically passed away before he was able to write the book. So I don't have much time to give you much background information on Faulkner. He was born in 1897 in small town Mississippi. He never graduated from high school, and yet inexplicably became one of the most profoundly influential writers of the 20th century, sharing the ranks with Dostoevsky and Conrad and Proust. And he once said that all he wanted written on his gravestone was he wrote his books and then he died. So we'll just have that serve as his bio. He wrote his books and then he died. And he drank a lot. Yeah. I want to start off with a quote as a kind of a window into the material from one of my professors at Yale, the poet Christian Wyman. So I think it sets up the questions appropriately. The world no longer rises to our occasions. In Shakespeare, not only is individual crisis societal crisis, but human drama is cosmic drama. The heavens blaze forth the death of princes. The suffering of individual characters is mirrored by or answered by the suffering of the world. When these two anguishes come to a head, when a king's storms become the skies, when beasts begin whelping in the streets of Rome, the resolution is imminent. This correspondence between the inner world and the outer world contextualizes suffering, you might say. It defines it in terms of place and time. And defining pain, as any psychologist will tell you, is the first step towards resolving it. And I wanted to start with this quote because somehow at the turn of the 19th century, the literary world into which Faulkner emerges as a writer begins to change. It was a moment in literature and history where shared cultural meanings, which used to provide the essential links between the self and the world, begin to break down. Where literature in earlier times might be understood as dramatizing man's inner conflicts according to a set of shared values or shared meanings which confirmed a man's place in the cosmos, man wakes up in, pick a date, 1914, as good as Eddie, and to discover that there's quite literally no place in the world for his inner drama of love and suffering. As Walker Percy put it, it was a literary world in which man discovered that his shared covenant with memory and history was abrogated for the loneliness of the existential self. And Faulkner, from his earliest days, explored this place, man's newfound place of permanent exile, cut off from a world in which he longed for but could never quite participate, even down from his earliest poetry as a teenager. And he articulated this moment so beautifully during one of his speeches at the University of Virginia, in which he was asked about contemporary writers and what he was supposed to say to young writers. And he said something beautiful about Holden Caulfield, which I think is so appropriate and meaningful for Faulkner's work. Faulkner, this is a letter to young writers. Today, the young writer's characters are forced to function not in their individuality, but in isolation. not to pursue in myriad company the anguishes and hopes of all human hearts in a world of a few simple, comprehensible truths and moral principles, but rather they exist alone inside a vacuum of facts which they did not choose and cannot possibly cope with, and finally cannot escape from, like a fly inside an inverted tumbler. Because this one, Holden Caulfield, expresses so completely what I had wanted to say. A youth, a father to what will must someday be a man, more intelligent than some and more sensitive than most, who by instinct, or because God had put it there, loved man and wished to be a part of mankind, humanity. He tried to join the human race and failed. To me, his tragedy was not that he was, as he perhaps thought, not tough enough, or brave enough, or deserving enough to be accepted into humanity. His tragedy was that when he attempted to join the human race, there was no human race there. There was nothing for Holden to do save buzz like a fly, frantic and inviolate, inside the glass walls of his inverted tumbler until he either gave up or was himself, by his own frantic buzzing, destroyed. And I can't stress enough how much this crisis of meaning troubled Faulkner more than any other single question. It was finally not just a literary question, but a moral and a religious question. How do we once again uncover the shared world of meaning, discovering the forgotten links between the self and the world? How do we show that human love and suffering and pity and compassion and sacrifice, which Faulkner called the eternal verities and truths of the heart, are not simply fictions trapped in the dark castle of consciousness, but find their meaning and place within the world? How do we rescue man from buzzing, frantic and inviolate, trapped in the walls of his inverted tumbler? And quite simply for Faulkner, this was the simple question of how do we tell the story? And this question of how we tell the story is the only question for Faulkner, because the story is everything. He once famously said, "I don't read philosophy because philosophy can't cast a shadow." And he told a New York Times reporter that all the psychology he ever learned, he learned at the poker table. And so the entire human fabric of reality was wrapped up in the stories which we tell. They constitute our covenant with each other, with memory, with history, and finally with God. Faulkner's 1939 novel, If I Forget Thee, Jerusalem, which his publishers made him change to Wild Palms because that's what publishers do. He took the title from Psalm 139 because I believe that horrifyingly dark and complicated novel is obsessed with the question that haunted Faulkner, which was, how do we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? This was Faulkner's question he would return to. How do we sing the Lord's song in modern life? How do you tell the story? And so while I know Faulkner, so many people give up on Faulkner, and he does have an outrageously demanding and experimental and difficult style. People like to use the term stream of consciousness, which is usually used by people that don't really know Faulkner, and they like to say it when they're around a cheese plate or something. But I think it's important to understand that Faulkner isn't engaging in clever Joycean theatrics for his own sake, or attempting to just be a superficially clever in that way. It's actually coming from an incredibly earnest place of Faulkner trying to strive to figure out how we sing the Lord's song in a strange land. As Faulkner said during a speech in Milan, I'm not trying to be difficult, I'm not trying to be obscure, I'm not trying to be stylish, I'm trying to tell the truth. And the truth of the story for Faulkner is always in some way wrapped up in man's rediscovery of God. I don't have enough time to defend that in some sort of a coherent way. But I think it's beautifully portrayed in Faulkner's one-paragraph review of Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea. So simple and beautiful. He says, "This was his best. This time he discovered God, a creator. This time he wrote about pity, about something somewhere that made them all, the old man who had to catch the fish and lose it, the fish that had to be caught and then lost, the sharks which had to rob the old man of his fish, made them all, loved them all, and pitied them all. It's all right. Praise God that whatever made and loves and pities Hemingway kept him from touching it any further. So with this in mind, I don't know how much time I have. I'm not very good at planning these things. But I'd like to just give you a brief window into the text so maybe you can see what I'm talking about. And maybe I'd like to talk about the first paragraph of Faulkner's 1929 masterpiece, The Sound and the Fury. Faulkner has this powerful way of telling you the entire symbolic structure of a story in the first paragraph. It's like nothing I've ever experienced. It's very Catholic in certain ways. It's just that the symbolic pattern of reality is in nature itself. So if you tell the story of one part, you tell the whole. And it's just absolutely breathtaking the way Faulkner does it. I think only Dante, in the use of symbolism, in my experience, comes close. But the Sound and the Fury was Faulkner's favorite novel, but it was a catastrophic failure, and it went unread for decades, and it garnered such fantastic reviews as considerably incoherent, signifying nothing, and my personal favorite from the New York Times, confusing and probably fascist. The Sound and the Fury is an exceedingly demanding novel, and Faulkner gets lost in the fury of his creative genius, and you kind of have to assent to it and allow yourself to get swept into it also, if you're going to get anything out of it. If you hold it at arm's length and try to analyze it, you're going to miss it. So you got to get lost, and then once you're through the rabbit hole, you can look back and start to understand what just happened. But I think that this is an Easter story for the modern world. It's an Easter story for people who have lost their story. It is an Easter story for people trapped in the prison of their own consciousness. The novel takes place in Faulkner's mythical pageantry of Yoknapatawpah County in northern Mississippi and centers around the spiritual, economic, and moral decline of a single family, the once proud and aristocratic Compsons. The story unfolds over Holy Week from the vantage of the tortured consciousness of the three Compson brothers. Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and then finally ending on Easter Sunday. It actually starts with Holy Saturday, and happens in different years and different times, and so what Faulkner's up to with time is for another talk. But he obviously gets the title. He was going to call it the Sound and the Fury Twilight, but in all of his Faulknerian clairvoyance, he knew that was going to be a mediocre teeny bopper vampire series in the 2000s, and so he didn't. He went with The Sound and the Fury. And I'd just like to read this little bit for you, and I recommend if you dive into The Sound and the Fury again to memorize this, because it's everywhere, and if you memorize it, you'll recognize it as you come across it. So, tomorrow, tomorrow, and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the ways to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Did I get texted because I'm out of time?
You are.
Sorry.
You got like 5 minutes left.
Best day ever. Sweet.
Yeah.
Great. Faulkner chose this quote for two reasons. The first is that the book is quite literally a tale told by an idiot, as the first section is told from the conscience of the youngest brother, Benjamin, who is severely mentally disabled, incapable of communication, and he's only able to moan and scream. So it's literally a tale told by an idiot. But secondly, Faulkner is also articulating a certain type of despair, which he'll grapple with throughout the novel, and that's the despair of man exiled from the world of meaning. It is the despair of when we go on acting as though the world has meaning, but in the deepest part of ourselves, we know it doesn't mean anything. And so, as you read The Sound and the Fury, Faulkner forces you to sit with the weight of this despair. He forces you to reckon with it in a way that is personally terrifying. It was for me. I was absolutely catatonically emotional when I first read The Sound and Fury. But Faulkner once described writing, the task of writing for him, as the Passion Week of the heart. And I just think that's such a beautiful description. Writing is the Passion Week of the heart, something articulating both its personal agony and grace. And I think Faulkner wants to force you to feel the sort of despair one must encounter in order to be entitled of some authentic hope. So be ready for that if you dive in. And the novel opens up April 7th, 1918, Holy Saturday, from the perspective of the youngest brother, Benjamin. It's his 33rd birthday, the same age of Christ at his crucifixion. And this is usually the section that presents the most difficulty for first-time readers. Benji is incapable of speech, and so he only howls, and he's howling throughout the entire novel. Benji's reality is intentionally disorienting, and Faulkner wants you to become disoriented. He wants to take you, in order to understand it, you have to let go of all of your abstract, rational parts of your brain that are trying to understand it, and you just have to get lost in Benji's way of seeing the world. And it's utterly disorienting. The more you let yourself go, the more you'll understand it. And because Benji is also incapable of distinguishing between past and present, and also cause and effect. And so reality is sort of this unceasing onslaught of Heideggerian phenomena, which, 2 minutes, shoot. 2 minutes is the worst amount of time I could have. Okay. A reality which you experience as bright shapes. Just hit a buzzer when I'm out of time. I'm just gonna keep going. So this unceasing present in which Benji experiences phenomena, Faulkner refers to as the bright shapes. It's just bright shapes. And these bright shapes only occasionally cohere into some sort of recognizable reality. And as soon as Benjamin experiences some emotional distress, the reality breaks back up into, and they just, bright shapes don't cohere into any sort of meaningful reality. But the fixed point, the orienting aspect of Benji's reality is his lost sister, Caddy. That is his orienting, his still point in the turning universe is Caddy Compson, a rebellious and tragic little girl who Faulkner called his heart's darling. She was the only girl who ever loved him, and she is the only one that would hold him through the night to make him stop screaming. And Benji is always saying she makes the bright shapes run smooth again, like when Caddy says we are going to sleep. She is the girl who used to return home every Christmas, but has now fled the house forever. And yet, Benjamin waits by the fence every Christmas for her return. So I'm just going to read you the very beginning of this scene. Through the fence, between the curling flower spaces, I could see them hitting. They were coming toward where the flag was, and I went along the fence. Luster was hunting in the grass by the flower tree. They took the flag out, and they were hitting, and they put the flag back, and they went to the table, and he hit, and the other hit. Then they went on, and I went along the fence. Luster came away from the flower tree, and we went along the fence, and they stopped, and we stopped, and I looked through the fence while Luster was hunting in the grass. Here, Caddy, he hit. They went across the pasture. I held the fence and watched them going away. Listen at you now, Luster said. Ain't you something? 33 years old going on that way, after I went all the way to town to buy you that cake. Hush up that moaning. Ain't you going to help me find that quarter so I can go to the show tonight? They were hitting little across the pasture. I went back along the fence to where the flag was. It flapped on the bright grass and the trees. And so, what's going on here? We open up and we're already disoriented. And the story opens with Benji Compson on his 33rd birthday, clutching the fence at the edge of the Compson family estate, accompanied by his caretaker, Luster, and staring out at the golf course. And staring out, he's looking at a golf course, which you don't realize until later. And as the novel proceeds, you find out that this golf course was meant to be Benji's inheritance, and it's been sold. And it's been Benji's share of the Compson family estate has been sold to pay for his sister Caddy's shotgun wedding and his brother Quentin to go to Harvard, where Quentin will eventually commit suicide. And as Benji is staring at the golf course, am I done, Jeff?
We'll give you another minute. Space and time.
1 minute. Okay. Sorry. Okay. We'll fast track this one. Okay. So the point, the golfer calls for his caddy. Benji recognizes the sound of his sister's name, and he begins screaming. And Faulkner describes this screaming as the sound of all mindless and tongueless human agony under the sun. It was not. It might have been. It was nothing, just sound. It might have been the sound of all injustice and sorrow made vocal for an instant, as though by a conjunction of the planets. And while no image is purely symbolic, Faulkner's trying to say something about where you are. He's trying to put you into the moment where you need to be in order to once again tell the Easter story in a strange land. And that is, we are all clutching the fence on the outskirts of our own existence, staring at a world in which the inheritance we were meant to receive has been sold. And it's been sold for golf courses, and it's been sold for Harvard degrees, and it's been sold for shotgun weddings. And we are all faced with an unspeakable, inarticulable sadness in the face of this. It's a sadness that all of us bear that we are not able to speak. That's why he needs Benji to tell the story. But in the midst of this, Faulkner pushes your mind to what is the orienting feature of Benji's reality. He's making you become Benjamin because you realize what informs and coheres reality together is the love of Caddy. It's not just his lost inheritance. That Caddy is the one who, in the midst of whatever despair you might feel in life, will be the love to once again make the bright shapes run smoothly again and make you able to sleep. So I know that I'm out of time, but this is an Easter story for the modern world. It's an Easter story in the face of despair, and it's something that's so not talked about much with Faulkner. And so I hope he's declined in popularity over the last 20 years, and I blame iPhones. So give him another chance. So thanks.
Thank you, James. That was wonderful. Next, we have Jay Martin, who, again, will be talking, Where Did You Sleep Last Night? The Foreclosure of Desire and the Failure of Law in the Americana Murder Ballad. We have handouts here, which I'll pass around, some lyrics of murder ballads. So. Thank you, Jay.
Thanks. For those of you who know me, I want to register my noblesse oblige in not treating Snoop Dogg's Murder is the Case today. There we go. Okay. In 1827, the great English satirist Thomas de Quincey published what was purported to be the transcript of an address to a certain society of gentlemen on the aesthetic appreciation of murder. On murder considered as one of the fine arts is a hyperbolized celebration of the harrowing 1811 London Ratcliffe highway murders committed by John Williams, who in the space of a fortnight gruesomely dispatched 7 victims from 2 households, including servants and young children. Williams was arrested and imprisoned, but preferred to deliver his own capital sentence by hanging himself in a cell before the court could render theirs. De Quincey's essay, a decade and a half later, revisits the murder in a thorough, even forensic aesthetic analysis of the artistry and skill evident in Williams' crime. The manner and method of the killings, the choice of victims, the choreography and sequence of their murders, the aesthetic satisfaction elicited in the moral uprightness of the victims, even the exquisite titillation of depriving a family of young children of a father upon whom they are, quote, wholly dependent upon his exertions by way of deepening the pathos, end quote. Upon its publication, the essay was celebrated in literary circles. An admiring G.K. Chesterton referred to De Quincey as, quote, the first and most powerful of the decadents, adding that whatever pinpricks one endures at the pen of Oscar Wilde or James Whistler will largely have been already said and said better by De Quincey. The popularity of the piece elicited a second essay on murder as a fine art, as well as a vigorous and devastating postscript. In the second essay, he assures us that, quote, As to murder, I never committed one in my life. It's a well-known thing amongst all my friends. Yet the sharpness and self-exculpation of De Quincey's satire is a bit misleading. Even a cursory glance at his autobiography, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, confirms that with De Quincey we are probably not in the company of the altogether morally upright, and certainly not a moralist. As a minimal threshold, what the essays on murder best represent is a form of encyclopedism, somewhere between Diderot and Sade, a literate mastery of crime in which the diabolical admixture of technique and effect, proportion and harmony, formed a lexicon for an appreciation of wanton criminality. As with the writings of Sade, on murder is an effigy of Enlightenment rationality, a demonstration of an aspirational omniscience and omnicompetence with respect to all things homicidal. Yet unlike Sade, De Quincey mediates Sade's personal enthusiasm with satire. Whereas Sade revels in the very possibility of bringing transgression to its conceptual limits and narrating it, De Quincey simply examines it, considers it, savors it, not as a practitioner but as a connoisseur. Sade and De Quincey do, however, share one essential trait. For both, the tremendum of crime serves as a principle of individuation. For Sade, it is those who identify absolutely with the will to terror of the criminal who reveal themselves as truly sovereign. For De Quincey, it is those who are able to sniff at it, take it in impassively, who reveal themselves as surpassing the prudishness of the Victorian age. Each point beyond good and evil, the former as tragedy, the latter as farce, both nihilistic in equal measure. Like De Quincey, my own interest in murder is avocational, and in fact, the material act of murder will hopefully be the least interesting part of my paper. Unlike De Quincey, I have not a Victorian bone in my body, thus my preference is for a more self-suited genre, namely the Americana murder ballad. If W.V. Quine can blithely declare his taste for desert landscapes, then I'm surely justified were I to opt for a snort of Kentucky straight bourbon rather than a stem of Burgundy. Thus, I will not proceed even with the faintest appreciation for the subject, as, and I insist on this point, the more I read and think about murder, the less I care for it. In this paper, I wish to explore an alternative to musicological or ethnomusicological approaches to the murder ballad, that is, songs, as the folk singer Gillian Welch recently put it, about killin', as they are found in the Appalachian and bluegrass songbooks, in favor of a more literary one, and as such, consider them as distant cousins of some remove from the literary valorations of crime in the Sade, De Quincey, and kin. More specifically, we will pursue the interplay of conscious and unconscious forces on the matters of narrativity and how those forces are mediated and complexified not only by the transposition of such narratives into song, but also how the genre distinctives, culture, and transmission of folk music brings their own, and as I will argue, decisive complications. Theological reflection might follow, not merely because murder is a surprisingly prominent biblical theme, but rather because when done properly, theology can and should be prepared to talk about anything. I will take two particular Americana murder ballads as representative of the genre and hope to make the case from such a limited sample. First, there's the song immortalized by Leadbelly, born Huddy Ledbetter, Where Did You Sleep Last Night, also In the Pines, a song known to a generation of a certain vintage, my own, by Kurt Cobain's cover in the 90s. Second is Banks of the Ohio, performed by the likes of Doc Watson, Johnny Cash, Joan Baez, and many others. Olivia Newton-John, I think, is up in there. The composers of these songs are long unknown, but I will argue that it is a feature of the murder ballad as such, in both its old and new world varieties, that they generally bear a sort of virtual anonymity. That is, even if the original composer is known, ownership is forfeited not only in the mode of narration, but also in its transmission between interpretation by other performers. Perhaps this forfeiture is a feature of music in general, but I want to argue for a uniqueness with respect to the way in which the murder ballad forecloses authorial and performative ownership altogether. Furthermore, this virtual anonymity is mirrored within the ballad by a constitutive elision of the first person in the narrative position, evident in the erasure of any personal identification beyond the use of a personal pronoun. Thus, the correlation between narrative dynamics of the Americana murder ballad and the discrete subject of discourse of psychoanalysis, namely the discovery and science of the unconscious, will be predicated upon a shared pessimism of the reliability and perspicuity of the reflexive experience of first-person subjectivity. There is, however, a deeper connection between the murder ballad and psychoanalysis, a connection formed by De Quincey. One of the most fascinating features of both the recounting his experience with opium, as well as his reflections on murder, is De Quincey's ambivalent use of dreams, as both metaphors for the liminal and ecstatic experience of drug use, and either the elation that comes in committing a murder or the terror of encountering one, as well as the metacognitive structure for understanding those experiences. More interesting even is De Quincey's proto-Freudian understanding of how dreams reveal the psychical depth dimension of the unconscious, what he called the subconscious, a term he in fact coined, and how it menaces the conscious mind, language, and thought. De Quincey anticipates, though in his own and singular way, Freud's insight that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. In his essay on the knocking at the gate of Macbeth, he writes, "The murderers and the murder must be insulated, cut off by immeasurable gulf from the ordinary tide and succession of human affairs, locked up and sequestered in some deep recess. We must be sensible that the world of ordinary life is suddenly arrested, laid asleep tranced, racked into dread armistice. Time must be annihilated, relation to things without abolished, and all must pass self-withdrawn into the deep syncope and suspension of earthly passion." End quote. Note the manner in which the act of murder, both criminal and victim, condenses within the temporal order, within temporality itself, hidden from it, and enter into a sort of dormition of the ordinary, such that any reference to it fails. Murder is thus an uncarved block, a saturated phenomenon in which in an excess of criminal intentionality transignifies an act of killing into the event of murder. It is Apollo's archaic torso that sees entirely and yet whose entirety remains unseen. De Quincey's rhapsodic essay Dream Fugue, which is incredible, makes the outright identification between death and the dream. It begins with the exclamation, quote, "passion of sudden death," and proceeds as a fevered paean to death, dying, and the dead. Yet it concludes in a vision of peace, an unsettling passage worth quoting at length. Quote, "Suddenly did God relent, suffered thy angel to turn aside his arm. 1,000 times amongst the phantoms of sleep he has shown thee to me, standing before the golden dawn and ready to enter its gates, with the dreadful word going before thee, with the armies of the grave before thee, shown thee to me, sinking, rising, fluttering, fainting, and then suddenly reconciled, adoring. 1,000 times he has followed thee in the worlds of sleep, through storms, through desert seas, through the darkness of quicksands, through fugues and the persecution of fugues, through dreams and the dreadful resurrections that are dreams, that are in dreams, only that at the last, with one motion of his victorious arm, he might record and emblazon the endless resurrections of his love." End quote. It is fascinating that in one sense De Quincey's revelation of peace is nothing more than the Christian assurance of the resurrection. It is not, however, a consolation of grief or of mortality, but rather a recognition, a ratification of his deep and abiding belief in the beauty and integrity of death, a recognition that comes only through the fugal crucible of dreaming death, which, and to make no mistake, is no less the nocturnal domain of both the opiate eater and their murderer on account of God's redemption of it. It is this fugal quality that I find so suggestive in the narrative aspect of the murder ballad, which I argue is a sort of field effect of the complex of virtual anonymity on the one hand and the deranging of first-person subjectivity on the other. I take this as a clue that the murder ballad, like Murder and Opium, can put one well down that royal road to the unconscious. Take, for instance, Where Did You Sleep Last Night? The brutally gestural retelling in two voices of a woman who pursues her cuckolded husband only to discover that he's been killed and his head found in the wheel well of a locomotive. Each verse, with the exception of the third, begins in the same way. My girl, my girl. Yet it is not clear who is calling out, who or what is behind the interpolative my girl. The possessiveness of my and the intimacy of girl in the address are both deeply troubling upon realizing that the voice could not be that of her husband. It is the same voice that tells us that her husband has been killed. Moreover, the admonition to lie is personalized. Don't lie to me, which is in the next line. The deranging effect of the address on the woman is indicated by the shifts in tense and grammatical mood of her response. Quote, in the pines where the sun don't ever shine, I would shiver the whole night through. The dynamic at play here is described by the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan in terms of a distinction between what he calls the subject of the enunciated and the subject of enunciation. That is, the subject or ego who speaks in the first person as the I, and the subject that emerges from within speech as it is articulated, yet emerges as distinct from or in contradiction to the subject of the enunciation, that is, the speaker. It is the subject of the unconscious. Where the subject of the enunciated represents the speaker, the subject of enunciation is represented in and by speech as such. For Lacan, quote, language is not a code precisely because in its least enunciation it carries with it the subject present in the enunciating. That is, the speech of the woman, despite the lure of the narrative sequence, creates the condition of the possibility of the address to her. It is through her own speech that the addresser emerges and is constituted. In other words, the possibility of a response or accounting is always already in the shadow of this emergent interrogator, the unconscious. Thus, Lacan brings us through to an aspect of guilt latent in the song, namely that the song is not, in the first instance, about grief over infidelity and death, but rather is first a grievous confession of the inability to comprehend grief and reckon oneself to it. Unlike Where Did He Sleep Last Night, Banks of the Ohio is an explicit, apparently uncomplicated first-person account of a murder by the murderess. She recounts how she lures her beloved to the water's edge and stabs him with a knife, a punishment for his refusal to marry her. Quote, "And only say that you'll be mine, in no other arms entwine." Unquote. Note the inversion of the spectral interpolation in Where Did You Sleep Last Night? Though the murderess refers to her victim as her love throughout, it's only the victim himself who addresses his killer directly as my love within the song. There's an estrangement, it would seem, between the desire of the murderess as she narrates the event and her speech, as her only direct words to him consist in the lure of a romantic walk and the demand to pledge his fidelity to her. Rick Luce describes the process by which desire calcifies into expectation, marked often by an occasion of acting out. Such acts are, quote, "committed in relation to an implicit ideal and represent the desire to satisfy, to fulfill or satisfy a demand which took the form of an expectation," end quote. In the Banks of the Ohio, then, not only has the desire of the murderess contracted into expectation, but that her expectation has been raised to the level of law, that is, as an injunction of the superego. Moreover, her expectation is more than the mere expectation of a proposal. Rather, it is the expectation of her desire, it is the expectation of the satisfaction of her desire as such. It is the expectation of the satisfaction of her desire as such, of being loved according to her own ideal, that is, of having jouissance or enjoyment and the eternal sunshine of fulfilled desire returned to her, the lack of which she experiences as primordial loss. Such desire, real desire, Lacan contends, is a paradox. It, quote, "can be articulated, but is not articulable. It is reducible to demand and irreducible to demand and necessity, cannot be named, cannot be sifted. It is of the order of unconscious fault," end quote. In other words, when desire becomes expectation, it moves from paradox to contradiction. The logic of frustrated desire, here and in other murder ballads, then is not founded on love, unrequited as it may appear, but is rather founded on the impossibility of the self-satisfaction of desire, insofar as it is predicated upon the moment, quote, "when a flawed and imperfect substitute, here the beloved, for a supposedly lost primordial jouissance, that is, for fulfilled desire, is treated as the very incarnation of this jouissance, of this enjoyment," end quote. Law, in the form of both the force of the superego, as well as its externalization as the force of legality, fails and must fail with respect to desire. There is no other option. It is just as impossible to meet the demands of the superego as it is for the civil law to resolve the deadlocks brought about by it. Recall the response of the victim in Banks of the Ohio. Oh, sweet. Recall the response of the victim in Banks of the Ohio. Quote, "My love, don't you murder me. I'm not prepared for eternity," end quote. He names her act as murder, the condemnation, evaluation. And in stating his unreadiness for eternity, he not only pleads for his life, but appeals to a law higher than the law of her desire. In the next verse, after she kills him, she asks God what she's done before answering her own question. Quote, "I've killed the only man I love. He would not take me for his bride," end quote. It is worth noting that it is not the divine law that condemns, it is hers. His appeal to the divine law is echoed by her return to herself, signaled by the fact that her "my God, what have I done?" amounts to little more than a Promethean confrontation of God with the force of her will. Both of these ballads help to elucidate what Lacan meant in his famous maxim, "There is no relationship between the sexes." Of course, he was not referring to sexual intercourse, of which Lacan remained throughout his life an enthusiast. It is the claim that there is simply no unmediated relationship between the sexes, that the relationship between the sexes is governed by the phallus, Lacan's term for the object signifier of the lack inherent in desire and sexual difference. It is not the male anatomy, a distinction that Freud doesn't make, which means nothing inheres in sexual difference but an absence. There is no instinctive relationship between the sexes. Natural harmony between them is impossible. Their natural state is structured by rivalry. For Lacan, sexual difference is not a difference marked by anything other than lack. Granted, Such a picture can seem rather grim, but it's not as bad as all that. For Lacan, it is precisely the impossibility of an inherent lack in the sexual relationship upon which the very possibility of love is founded. Love, in Lacanian parlance, is an imaginary function that compensates for and patches over the absence of the sexual relationship. Love is an illusion, a, quote, specular mirage of oneness between lovers, but it is no less real on account of it. Lacan's point is that love stands in for the absence of the sexual relationship, makes that absence bearable, and compels us to strive for it. Put otherwise, all this is to say that there is no human relationship in which love is not only at home in it, but also necessary to it. Those murder ballads about forlorn love gone bad raise the question not of why love fails, but how. The why is answered easily enough with recourse to the litany of infidelities, rejections, cruelties, and neglect that are familiar enough to be quotidian. The how question, however, is not answered so easily. What we see through Lacanian lenses, in banks of the Ohio, for instance, is the fatal mistake in any economy of love, which is to stipulate the sexual relationship, that is to stipulate oneness between perfect oneness between persons, to deny its constitutive lack, to insist upon that impossible primordial oneness that admits no absence, only presence. And therein lies the rub. A true and positive sexual relationship would make love impossible. That's to say, a true and positive kind of primary, naive oneness would make love impossible, insofar as without lack there is nothing to love. Nothing to love in the sense of its object cause, and nothing to love in the sense that without lack we have nothing to communicate in love, or in loving. As for Lacan, to love is to give what we do not have. Thanks.
Thank you, Jay. And you donated 2 of your minutes to James, so we're all good. Finally, closing up with our presentations will be Carole Baker from Duke. She'll be talking about the icon as exemplary image, reflections on iconology and the visual arts, and appropriately, she will have visual arts for us as well. Thank you, Carole.
It's going to take me just a second to... Well, thank you so much for allowing me to join you today. Just a very quick, I appreciated hearing James's remarks about how you came to Faulkner. So I'll just briefly say that I was raised Protestant in the South, in Nashville, Tennessee. And I was working on my first degree in theology at a tiny little liberal arts Nazarene school called Trevecca Nazarene University. And I think it was when I went to Cokesbury Bookstore one day, which if you don't know what that is, that's the big Methodist publishing house, that I first came across this book by Pavel Florensky called Iconostasis. And I have no idea what drew me to this book, but I bought it and I read it, and I had a lot of questions. So I looked up one of the translators, a man named Donald Sheehan, and came across something that he had written about Dostoevsky and Donald's own conversion to orthodoxy. I somehow found the parish that he belonged to, and so I first contacted his priest to see if he could put me in touch with Donald, because I had a lot of questions about Florensky. And he did. And what happened over the coming months was a true gift. Rather than answering my questions about Florensky, Donald just befriended me. I don't know if he ever answered a question I had about Florensky, but he wrote to me, and this was not through email. We wrote letters, and he became a sort of big brother to me. I later discovered when I began studying with the Prosopan School of Iconology, which is a Russian Orthodox school of iconology, that my instructor, Dimitri, his son, Donald Sheehan, is the godfather of his son. So this was a really surprising and wonderful gift to see all these connections come together. Donald has now passed, but I'm often reminded of him when I'm revisiting Florensky again. So I don't know if you can dedicate a paper presentation to anyone, but I'm dedicating this moment to my dear friend, Donald Sheehan. There's been something of a visual turn in both contemporary theology and philosophy, and part of that turn has been the recovery or reassessment of the iconology that has been present in the Christian East for some time. This has meant a recovery of the ecclesial icon and new explorations of its relevance for theology and visual theory today. Yet the icon is more than the historical precursor to subsequent arts. For Christians, it is the image, an image set apart. In what follows, I will briefly show how three thinkers, Cornelia Saccharidou, Pavel Florensky, and Jean-Luc Marion, show in similar and dissimilar ways how it is that the icon enjoys the status of being the exemplary image. Saccharidou and Marion are both contemporary thinkers. She's in the philosophy department at LaSalle University, and he is in the University of Chicago's Divinity School, as well as being emeritus professor of philosophy at the Sorbonne. Pavel Florensky was an Orthodox priest, as well as being a brilliant scientist, mathematician, and physicist. He was shot and killed in a gulag in 1937, and Solzhenitsyn is noted to have said that Father Florensky was perhaps the most remarkable person devoured by the gulag. The designation exemplary image is used by Cornelia Saccharidou in her book, Icons in Time, Persons in Eternity, in which she argues that we are in need of a, quote, new Christian image, end quote. What she means by this, as it turns out, is that we need a new approach to the ecclesial icon that avoids the pitfalls she identifies in past theologies and theories from both the Christian West and East. She will ultimately argue it is Eastern Orthodox ontology, and in particular the ontology of Maximus the Confessor, that provides the necessary context for liberating the icon from what she deems to be unnecessary constraints. The unnecessary constraints she identifies are the result of theories, ideologies, and theologies that she argues have been over-determinative for the icon, resulting in a loss of the icon's objective autonomy. Moreover, she aspires to extend this new approach to other art forms in light of a proper rehabilitation of the icon. In order for the icon to be the exemplary image, Saccharidou contends it must, of its own standing, consistently exemplify or manifest Christian truths better than other images. She develops an argument showing that the icon does this, not through its beauty, a concept she feels is overused in the Christian West, but through its energia. On a basic level, energia is known or recognized as vividness. In the icon, this vividness corresponds to the Orthodox ontology she champions, first in Maximian ontology and later in Gregory Palamas's theology of the divine energies. Here it is important to note a critique Saccarino makes of the theological metaphysics typically used to contextualize the icon. She is critical of the pseudo-Dionysian theology, which, drawing on Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy, imposes a hierarchy whereby the image, like all material things, must be transcended in order to reach the intellective spiritual truths. She reads this as a material pessimism, which will never permit the icon to become a theophanic being, able to facilitate a divine encounter in its own autonomous being. Instead, she counters that it is a Maximian ontology that more fully embraces materiality and sees in all creation an infused spirituality, making our interactions with the material world an occasion for supersensible revelation. According to this, Saccarino contends, the icon is thereby permitted its autonomy and consequently the possibility of becoming a theophanic being. This ontology corresponds to the theology of divine energies, which assumes created things embody and transmit energia. The icon does this in its kenosis and plenitude, which aesthetically is accomplished in the use of light and the paradoxical juxtaposition of stillness and movement. She will admit, however, that ultimately this requires a theological vision, or visualizing theologically, to be experienced by the viewer. Moreover, she admits that not all energetic images become theophanic, just as not every person reaches sainthood. Paweł Florensky argues similarly for the superiority, or what he calls the ontological superiority of the icon. And he does so, like Saccarino, from both an aesthetic and theological standpoint. In his essay on reverse perspective, Florensky goes to great lengths to correct the modern presumption that Byzantine and medieval arts are primitive and naive, as so many art historians and cultural theorists have treated them. He points out that it is presumptuous and naive to assume the Egyptian and Roman communities, who are otherwise credited with tremendous intellect and sophistication, were ignorant of the possibility of so-called natural perspective. In fact, there's visual evidence to the contrary. Therefore, given the empirical evidence of both their intellectual and artistic accomplishments, it is much more likely that these artists did not employ so-called natural perspective because it did not correspond to their worldview, mathematically or spiritually. The same, therefore, ought to be assumed of the Byzantines, whose sophistication is also widely acknowledged. It is clear in looking comparatively at early icons and iconographic programs that the simplicity and the choice of unnatural perspective was intentional and not the result of a naivete or primitivism. For both Byzantine and medieval artists, it should be understood that their technical and stylistic choices were intentional and meant to reflect a certain perception of reality. That perception, Florensky goes on to argue, is what was eventually displaced by what he calls the Euclidean Kantian schema, a philosophical and mathematical schema that reduced the world to a flat, singular, tyrannical vision centered on the right eye of the autonomous individual. I have a, let's see. I don't know how well you can see this. This is an etching of an artist. This is really an illustration of the very technique that Florensky is critiquing. You can see the artist with one eye covered, literally looking through a flat frame to create the illusion of perspectivism. Okay. Florensky, being a scientist and mathematician, shows how the so-called natural perspective is in fact an illusion and does not correspond to vision as it purports to do. In fact, all one has to do is introduce the other eye to natural perspective, and it will immediately come undone. It is, therefore, deceptive, and that it was overwhelmingly adopted as the assumed position of the modern viewer is an indication that the art that developed consequently is misleading. This critique can also be found in the book Iconostasis, but here he develops the argument more theologically and mystically. It should be noted, importantly, that Florensky would never concede that these things, that is, theology, metaphysics, and aesthetics, can be viewed separately. Rather, when you are speaking of one, you are necessarily speaking of the others. This is crucial for him, and it is crucial for understanding his argument regarding the superiority of the icon. In the essay mentioned above, Florensky states that all art is symbolic. Any art will manifest the theology or philosophy of its age. This is what it means for art to represent. What makes the icon different and superior is what it symbolizes, both in its content and in its form. The icon symbolizes theophany and corresponds to the theological anthropology that stems from the incarnation, the passion, the transfiguration, and the ascension of our Lord. The icon for Florensky will, like Christ, always be either more or less than it is. It will either be a painting on a piece of wood, or it will be an encounter with the divine. What we encounter in the icon is a face. But it is more. Like Saccharidou, Florensky sees transfigured light or divine energy permeating the image, which he describes occasions the transference of countenance. The face, or prosopon, as in a portrait, corresponds to the divine image by which all humanity is created. The countenance, as divine energy, corresponds to the likeness according to which humanity is made. That energy by which we are made like God is displayed in the icon by its unnatural or supernatural taboric light, which emanates from within the ones depicted. Ultimately, however, for Florensky, this process of divinization in the icon and the viewer cannot take place apart from participation in the divine liturgy, where each member of the community transgresses the visible to the invisible in order for the invisible to be made visible. This he will describe as the canonicity of all humanity, and in the realm of art, this process is described according to what he calls the arts of ascent and the arts of descent. Florensky does not deny that the arts of ascent may attain some spiritual quality, but it is only in the arts of descent, the holy images, that divinity deigns to manifest itself through the iconographer who submits to confession and the canons of the church. In his small collection of essays, The Crossing of the Visible, Jean-Luc Marion also makes a case for the superiority of the icon. The first two essays primarily address contemporary visual theory and painting, and here Marion also takes up the concept of perspective, although he treats this more conceptually than historically. Writing as a phenomenologist, Marion describes the necessary relationship between the visible and invisible. Oh dear. Stating that the visible only appears in direct proportion to the invisible. When encountering the art object, the visible arises from invisibility between the object and the viewer. This is what Marion refers to as the distance, creating a space which must be transgressed by the viewer's intentionality. Nothing is visible without this. Therefore, Marion posits two things are required for visibility: the object and the intentional experience of the viewer. Without either of these, visibility is short-circuited. However, the icon, or the image, becomes tyrannical when visibility becomes an end in itself. This observation leads him to conclude that every image becomes an idol, as in order to become visible, the image must meet the desires of the gaze. The object becomes visible according to the desire that produces it. I'm going to skip ahead because I'm running out of time. In his concluding essays, The Blind at Shiloh and The Prototype in the Image, Marion shows how the icon overcomes the tyranny of the image by avoiding a mimetic economy. According to the mimetic, the image represents, and what it represents ultimately is my desire. The icon avoids this in that it does not represent, it presents. And what it presents is another gaze by which I am confronted. Unlike other images, therefore, the icon presents the invisible prototype and consequently is venerated rather than simply being seen. Like Florensky, Marion ultimately sees the liturgy as the iconic economy whereby to pray is to be seen. And this becomes the necessary precondition for catechizing the gaze. For the gaze by which I am seen is not just any gaze, but the gaze of the Holy One. I'm going to skip a paragraph because I'm running out of time. I'll conclude by returning to my opening observation about the visual turn in theology. It is a good thing, I think, as the history of Christianity cannot and should not be surveyed apart from the cultures it has produced. It is clear that each of these thinkers I've only briefly touched on here understand there is unquestionably something at stake in the superiority or exemplarity of the icon, even if they are not in full agreement as to how that is achieved. One thing to be taken from these and others who have grappled with theology and visual theory is the implicit, sometimes explicit, affirmation that not all images are the same. It has long been a part of Christian tradition, an agonistic part, to think theologically about how to discern the invisible in the visible. This will always be the case. For Christians, the image is inescapable. For theologians, the question is not whether to think about images, but how. The icon, the exemplary image, shows us the way.
Thank you very much. So we have time for one question. Is There's two hands. Let's do two. You and then you. Yes. Please step up to the microphone so we can record you for posterity.
My name is Thomas Marsh. I am a Western classical studio artist, sculptor, painter, drawer. And my question for you is, what room do you have for my tradition in what you have outlined?
This one works.
Okay. So thank you very much for your question. I am also a Western-trained visual artist in addition to being an iconographer. So the question you've asked is something that I've sat with for a very long time. I'm also Roman Catholic now, and ironically, I am so because of the holy images and because of the theology, the Eastern theology of the holy images. So I would say there is obviously a long-standing critique from the East about how religious art has developed in the West. I just sort of gestured toward this in this talk, but part of that critique is in Florensky. If you've never read this book, I highly recommend it. I mean, it can get intense at times as far as this critique goes. But the argument is that in the Christian West, the turn toward naturalism was a turn toward shifting away from the theological focus of a sacramental art, as in the holy images, and a turn toward an anthropocentric center. So I think as a Roman Catholic who has a deep appreciation for Western art as well, I think that this is a legitimate critique, and I think it's one that we need to take seriously. But I also think it's something for us to not, how should I say it, take it seriously, but allow it to inform how we think about the ways in which these things might coexist. Like for right now, very simply, I'm comfortable with saying that the icon is a different kind of image. It functions differently. That doesn't mean an automatic depreciation of other art forms. And even Florensky allows for this. So I think it's something we need to sit with uncomfortably. And I think it's okay to do that, because I do think there is a certain crisis in the West when it comes to the image and the religious image. And I think we would do well to listen to our Eastern sisters and brothers on this issue, but to do so without feeling like we necessarily need to wash our hands of our own tradition. So that's the best answer.
Use your hand up.
That was essentially my question, but I'll go to my second question, which is to Jay. Why murder ballads? Is this like just that you're a big Nick Cave fan?
Yeah, I'm a shameless Nick Cave fan. When Jeff mentioned the possibility of putting a panel together, and that James who is an incredible musician, and I thought, but he was doing literature, I thought I would try to weird him out. No, but my own field of research really is in psychoanalysis. I do a lot of work with, my sort of, I guess, conceit is that I work in this liminal, transgressive, philosophical and literary tradition. I myself am the world's most boring Catholic. I believe everything the church teaches. But so for me, I sort of occupy this space to hopefully encourage people who have the same dark calling, that there's nothing to be fearful there. And so my wife is a musician and loves a murder ballad. So I've grown up with this for a long time. I'm a Southerner, so this is kind of part of me. And I thought, what a perfect way to have a real excuse to make people uncomfortable in public.
Well, thank you very much. for all three of you for a wonderful panel. Thank you for coming out this morning, and thank you for the Senate for hosting us. Have a great rest of the day.